Welcome back, everybody. I'm Larry Kudlow, and it's Free Market Tuesday here on the Kudlow Report. At the top of this half hour, who needs Air Force One when you can hit the road in a bus? That's right, Obama's out of Washington in the Midwest in what his critics are calling the magical misery tour. The president has talked a good deal about getting America back to work, but is the person who really should get America back to work the president himself? Let's talk. Here now is our free market panel. Bernard Whitman, Democratic strategist, president of Whitman Inside Strategies. Kevin Williamson returns, managing editor of the National Review, author of the Politically Incorrect Guide to Socialism, and the great T.J. Rogers, CEO of Cypress Semiconductor. T.J., I want to begin with you. What is this magic mystery tour or magic misery tour? And can you believe one of the White House geniuses now wants to set up, TJ, a Department of Jobs, just what we need in this country? What's your thinking here?
Well, I remember after President Obama was elected, he was is a superb campaigner. And after he was elected, he continued to campaign, and I said, what's with this? You're elected. You're president now. Go be president. You don't have to campaign. And he's going back to what he's comfortable with, campaigning, and he's out there selling himself, I guess, because the record's not good enough to sell.
Kevin Williamson, should the president be back in Washington, in the White House, calling the Congress to special session to actually do something about our fiscal problem and our economic problem and our jobs problem? I think that's the pulse of America. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I think he thinks his job is to give speeches, and he hasn't figured out that his job is a lot more than that. You know, I don't say this that often. What he should really do is listen to Newt Gingrich.
Ah.
Actually, I haven't said that in 10 years. Newt Gingrich has a really good idea, which is get Congress back in session, make every subcommittee come up with real cuts, with real program for getting our fiscal house in order, and that's the main thing you can do to get things stabilized and move forward from there. So it's going to take a while to rebuild the jobs, but you can get the finances in order, which is a good start.
Bernard, one of the unpleasantries in President Obama's bus tour is he is meeting with Tea Party people, and they're surrounding him, and they're buzzing him, they're buzz-bombing him, and they don't like it one bit. Now, your man doesn't like the Tea Party. What's he doing about this? So far, he's stuttering and stammering. What's your take? What's your advice?
Larry, I couldn't disagree with you more. Maybe I'm the walrus in this, but this is exactly what the president should be doing. I've argued for weeks he has to get out of Washington, get out of the Rose Garden, go out on the hustings, and sell his job creation program to the American people. Why? Because the Republican Congress, which is held captive by the Tea Party, has made it very clear that they will do anything and everything to stymie economic growth and the good of the country for short-term political gain.
What about raising taxes? What about regulations? Who's doing what to whom here? Isn't Obama the guy who's stifling job creation?
No, let me give you four ideas.
I appeal to your better spirits and higher intellect.
Let's do three things that are actually very conservative. Number one, let's cut taxes, extend the payroll tax holiday for employees and employers, give tax credits to vets to get them hired. Number two, we ought to invest in this infrastructure bank, create construction jobs. The unemployment in construction is 50% higher than the national average. $500 billion in construction could create 15 million new jobs. Why don't we streamline the patent approval process, create jobs for small business, unleash entrepreneurship in America? And finally, Mr. Free Trader, why don't we pass these free trade agreements with Korea, Colombia, and South Korea?
On this point, I agree. But, TJ, they never get free trade. They never get it done. And, TJ, I want to ask you. It's too easy. It's too easy to ask Kevin. I want to ask you, TJ Rogers. Does this country need a $550 billion infrastructure bank to get back on its economic feet?
No, I think the whole premise of the discussion, we need to get back to Washington to get something done, is wrong. You don't get things done in Washington. You get things undone in Washington. You suck money from the rest of the country, individuals and corporations, to Washington. You put it in the big pork barrel, and not nearly as much comes out of the pork barrel as goes in, and then that inefficiency is what leads to the lack of jobs and economic activity we have today. When Carter did the same thing that Obama's doing now, created a malaise in the economy, people don't remember, but Ronald Reagan came out of it as the guy who kind of turned it around. But Ronald Reagan's first 2-3 years were pretty ugly. He had to say no and cut, and say no and cut, and say no and cut for 3 years. There was a lot of suffering. Paul Volcker had to really screw down on the economy until they got the government to be small enough that the private sector took off and started creating jobs again. This problem's not going to get solved in Washington by creating some bank or some job. Every job they create costs more money to create than the job is worth. That's the problem. No, everybody talks about creating jobs, but they don't point out the fact that you have to create a job efficiently with a low amount of capital.
Right.
Italy's on its rear end right now because Italy has created all these so-called green jobs, but these jobs cost 2 times more, 3 times more to create than jobs in the sector. So when you suck money out of the private economy to create a green job, you lose 2 or 3 real jobs for every green job you create.
Spain had the same experience. Kevin Williamson, economic advisor Gene Sperling, who was an acquaintance, a former guest on this show, he wants a Department of Jobs, Kevin Williamson. Will that solve the problem, having a Department of Jobs?
You know, when I read that, I actually banged my head on my desk. I mean, I don't have real high hopes for President Obama in general, but it's the dumbest thing I think I've ever heard come out of the White House so far. You know, when he's not giving speeches about stuff, instead of actually doing something, he thinks his job is to go to meetings instead of departments to be in charge of things. You know, creating an agency to be in charge of a particular kind of problem is not the same thing as actually solving the problem. There are things we can do to attract capital, to get investment going, which long-term brings employment, which, you know, creates efficiency.
What would they
and all
be?
the rest
Give me
of
a,
it.
for instance, your number one Kevin Williamson priority.
Make the tax rates permanent wherever they end up. Make them permanent so people know where they're going to be.
He's taken Warren Buffett's line, and no one knows where that's going to lead. Higher taxes, rich people. When you hear rich people, don't you hear middle-class people?
No, we're talking to the mega rich. We're talking about multimillionaires.
Yeah, but who knows?
You know what? When Warren Buffett is talking about
there's
this
no money
stuff,
up there in the mega rich. They'll dodge it all. Middle-class people believe that they are next. Their noose is on the chopping block.
That's not true. That's because the Republicans have unfortunately convinced the middle class that for some reason a tax cut to multimillionaires is going to somehow trickle down to them. Trickle-down economics, my friend,
that's nonsense.
does not work.
We could tax every dollar in excess of $500,000 in every household in this country at 100%. Wouldn't cover last year's.
Cutting taxes on the rich is not a job creation
Bernard
program.
Whitman, thank you. Kevin Williamson and the great T.J. Rogers from Cypress Semiconductor. We appreciate it, gentlemen. Coming up on Kudlow, while the U.S.